السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ناصر المستضعفين، قاهر الجبابرة الطواغيت الظالمين، الذي جعل العاقبة للمتقين والعدوان على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. So again, we'll start with a quick recap of last week, inshallah ta'ala. So last week we covered the background and the key points relating to the Ramadan war, Operation Badr as it was called, which started on the 10th of Ramadan or Yom Kippur in 1973, where Egypt attacked the Israeli points on the east side of the Suez Canal within the Sinai Desert. So following the war, before the war, we discussed the peace offers that were made by the Egyptian president, and we also discussed Egypt-US ties. Egypt had ties with the USSR and the Soviet Union. They tried to get closer to the US. War was the best way to eventually make that happen. We discussed the oil embargo and the impact that had until that came to an end with the prices in Europe and leading to the recessions in the 1970s. Then after the agreement that was made in 1975 of the Israeli military forces withdrawing from the east side of the Suez Canal, but about 20 to 40 kilometers on various sections, with a UN peacekeeping force in the middle. And thereafter, the military aid that was given to Saudi Arabia by the US, which led to an end of the oil embargo, and also the military and economical aid that was given by the US to Egypt, and which continues until today, which we discussed last week, millions of dollars a year. Thereafter, we mentioned a couple of incidents that took place in 1976, June, and then in November 1977. The first was the hostages that were taken in Athens. So the plane was flying from Tel Aviv to Paris, stopover in Athens. Two Palestinians, two Germans took the plane to Uganda. We mentioned Idi Amin was the leader of the forces in Uganda at that time, and he was supporting the Palestinians. He welcomed the plane. If you want to know more about Idi Amin, they have a section dedicated to him in the Leicester Museum in New York. So you can see a lot of pictures because a lot of the Indians from Uganda came to Leicester. Anyway, that's a side topic. An operation was launched, Thunderbolt, renamed later Jonathan. The commander, who was the elder brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, was killed. 102 of the 106 Israeli hostages were rescued. 4 were killed. 45 Ugandan soldiers were killed. Obviously, the hostage takers, the Palestinians and the Germans, were killed. And thereafter, we discussed the visit of Sadat the first, Anwar Sadat the first, Arab Prime Minister, head of state, to visit the Knesset, and his speech where he says we want to work towards lasting peace and security, and we welcome you to live among us in peace and security. And this then led to the Camp David Accords from the 5th to the 17th of September 1978 in the US, and an agreement was reached between Israel and Egypt. Egypt recognized Israel. Egypt also said that Israel forces will withdraw from the Sinai Desert, which they eventually did over a period of 4 years until 1982, and normalized relations, peace, negotiations, etc. Meaning now Egypt was basically put to the side. They are not involved in any of the rights of the Palestinians, unable to do so because of this agreement that they have with Israel at the time, so they can't object to whatever Israeli ambitions they are in the region. And eventually Sadat was assassinated in October 1981. And thereafter we discussed in a bit of detail the events that took place in Lebanon. We discussed the background that Lebanon, after the Second World War and even following the First World War, but mainly after the Second World War, there was a internal strife. Initially, like in historical context, at the beginning of the 1900s, the Christians were in power. After the Khilafah and the Ottoman rule ended, the Christians came into power in Lebanon. Obviously, it was occupied by the French initially. The Christians were left in power when the French withdrew. However, the Christians were by that time, by the time we're discussing now in the 1970s, a minority as compared to the Muslims who had become the majority. And the Muslims were marginalized by the laws, etc., that were put in place by the minority Christian government. And this led to an internal strife. Obviously, there are different communities within Lebanon. There were the Shias, there were the Sunni, and there were the Christians, the three main. There were also the Druze, who were also an offshoot. You can read about them separately, but they have different beliefs. And they were the four main groups in Lebanon at the time. So the Lebanese Christians who were in rule, they were sided with the Western Bloc as normal. And so the internal strife went to a climax, you could say, in 1975, civil war between the factions inside Lebanon. The Palestinians, as we said, they were expelled from all the countries, so the PLO were based in Lebanon, and they would carry out cross-border raids on Israel and Israeli targets. Israel saw Lebanon as an opportunity, and we've seen this in the statements we read out last week by Israeli ministers and the founder of Israel, Ben-Gurion, etc., where they saw that Lebanon was the way to control the whole of the Middle East. And so they looked at the Maronite Christians who would come into power and rule as basically the puppet government of Israel, was allied with Israel, where they will implement the Israeli interests. And so on the 11th of March 1978, obviously there's attacks going back and forth. So 8 Palestinians, they hijack a bus. So they go by sea to Israel, they hijack a bus. The bus is en route to Tel Aviv. The Israeli military intervenes. There's a firefight, and about 34 Israelis are killed, including those Palestinians who were hijacking the bus. And this led to Israel, in a few days later, invading Lebanon. And they came in with 20,000 troops and started pushing through the southern part of Lebanon. However, they had to withdraw in a few days because of international condemnation. However, they were supporting a Lebanese Christian who was a military general, whose name was Major Saad Haddad. And he was the leader of the Christian militias in the south. And they had trained them in Israel, military training, provided them weapons, provided them with funds, etc., and tactics on how to take over the whole southern part of Lebanon away from the PLO and the Palestinian groups that were there and the other groups that were in that area. And so they handed over this whole area when they withdrew to their allies who were trained, funded, supported by the Israeli military. Anyway, so it didn't make much of a difference. The war continued. In any case, bombings, attacks, cross-border raids by both sides. The US brokered a deal, a peace deal, like a truce between the PLO and the Israeli army and the Israeli government in July 1981. However, Israel continued to plot, especially Ariel Sharon, who is now the defense minister. So we've discussed him in Egypt being the head of the army, the commander of the forces, before the commander of Unit 101. Now he is the defense minister. And then this is where we stopped last week. We mentioned a few other points, but we'll discuss them in more detail today. So what happened after that was in May 1982. So now we're talking from 1981 July, when the peace agreement has been brokered and agreed, until May 1982. If we were to read the reports, in fact, even statements of the US government officials, the PLO, there was hardly any recorded, if any at all. In fact, there were no recorded attacks, cross-border attacks by the PLO into Israeli borders during this whole period. However, Israel carried out hundreds of cross-border raids within that 1 year, hundreds, upwards of 600 raids, cross-border raids. And they would sometimes bomb, sometimes soldiers would go across, etc. And there were also UN peacekeepers inside Lebanon, on the southern, in the southern part of Lebanon, who were supposed to hold the peace. However, they would go past the areas where the UN peacekeepers are and bomb the PLO and the Palestinian group camps, locations north of the UN line, so deep in Lebanon. And so they had discussed with the US with regards to invading Lebanon. They wanted to destroy Palestinian resistance altogether. And the plan, which were leaked decades later, eventually showed that all of these discussions and the plans were all laid down by December 1981. So let alone what's happening in 1982. The plans to invade Lebanon had already in detail been laid down in 1981, provided and discussed in the Israeli cabinet. Eventually they decided that they were going to do it in stages to get the approval by the entire cabinet. And they also discussed these plans with the US, and the recorded meetings of the government officials, which obviously were released decades later, show that these discussions took place with the US. The representative of the Israeli government in the meeting informed the US cabinet and the officials, US officials who he was discussing with, defense ministers and other ministers and officials, the full Israeli plan to invade Lebanon. And all they got was silence. There was no comment. They weren't told you can't do it, nothing. Eventually, they were given a go-ahead, sort of a green light, that you can do it as long as there is some kind of provocation. Now, the agreement that was brokered between the US and the Palestinian groups, the PLO, in Lebanon, in July 1981, the terms of the peace deal were that, now obviously Israel doesn't recognize the PLO doesn't recognize Israel, so they won't talk to each other with the US. What has to happen is the Saudi representative, he comes on behalf of the PLO, he speaks to the US then speaks to Israel, and so that's how they come to an agreement. The agreement is that there will be no attacks from Lebanon and by the PLO from Lebanon across the border to Israel. Those are the terms. That does not mean that there won't be attacks from inside Israel or the occupied Palestinian territories. Internal attacks, those are possible, and they're not part of the agreement. Maybe cross-border attacks from Syria or from Jordan or even Egypt, or even international targets in other locations. These were not part of the truce, and this was known by the Israeli government, and it was clearly stipulated in this agreement that they had. Even the US officials on record clearly informing the Israeli counterparts that this agreement is specifically to the PLO in Lebanon cross-border attacks. However, how Ariel Sharon portrayed it was any attack that's done against Israeli targets anywhere in the world, whether it's from Lebanon, whether it's from inside the occupied territories, whether it's from Syria, Jordan, whether it's anywhere else in the world, we will regard it, so internally, we will regard it as a provocation and as contravening the terms of the peace agreement. Whereas obviously the peace agreement was not with all of these other caveats and these other locations. And so that's how they decided that they will play it. And so the opportunity was on the 3rd of June 1982. A group calling itself the Abu Nidal group. I'll just give an explanation to Abu Nidal group. But they shot the Israeli ambassador and seriously wounded him in London. on the 3rd of June 1982. Immediately, they said this is provocation. They blamed the PLO, and in response, they started bombing. On the 4th of June, they started an operation, invaded Lebanon with 200,000 troops. Initially they started with airstrikes, and a few days later they enter into Lebanon with their troops, and they go through, going all the way north, going to the outskirts of Beirut, cutting off the Beirut to Damascus highway, and taking over large parts of Lebanon. Carrying out massacres, atrocities on the way. We mentioned one of them in Ain al-Hilwa last week, where they told the residents of Ain al-Hilwa that anyone who does not bear arms, they will be allowed to go free. However, the residents of Ain al-Hilwa knew that they had got used to this rhetoric. You will be let go free, and then as soon as they come out, they are shot dead. So they fought to defend their town, and it took the Israeli military 8 days to take over this one town. But they eventually killed every single man who was in this town. And these atrocities continue from the 8th to the 13th of June 1982. Then were different sides in the conflict. So we had the Syrian forces. So the Syrian army was also present in Lebanon at this time. The Syrian army was on the side of the PLO with the internal strifes, because obviously the civil war had already been going on, and there was Israeli influence, and so there was Syrian influence. The Syrian army was already in Lebanon from before the Israeli invasion. The Syrian army was there. The number of troops were approximately 30,000. So approximately 30,000 Syrian troops were in Lebanon. Initially, it was an all-out war between the Syrian forces and the Israeli forces. So planes were bombing, like in one air battle, for example, 25 Syrian planes are shot down. They had about 600 tanks in Lebanon, and so there were a number of air fights, bombings on both sides, etc. However, the Israeli media, the Israeli government said that we do not want to attack Syria or the Syrian forces. They came to an agreement with the Syrian forces on the 13th that we will have a peace treaty. However, within 4 days they went and bombed the Syrian regiments that were there in Lebanon. And so this continued in the same way. So they had the treaty on the 11th. Within 4 days, on the 15th, they're bombing the Syrian regiment, and so the brigade, and so the war continues. The treaty comes to an end. In the same way, on the 13th, while the Israeli president is on the TV, and we mentioned this last week, saying that we do not aim to invade and enter into Beirut, he gets down from his speech and he sits down, and immediately the scenes of Israeli tanks entering suburbs of Beirut as shown on national TV. And from July till August, the bombing continued. Now, without going into the details of the war, etc., fighting was taking place all around the country in different areas. There were some pockets of very strong and stiff resistance against the Israeli army and the Israeli offensive. Some areas were taken over very quickly, some areas took longer. But without going into all of the military details, obviously the Syrian forces were more located towards north, towards in the Beqa Valley. In the Beqa Valley, which is north. We'll see a map soon, inshallah. So in the north, in the Beqa Valley, and this is a strategic location. From there, there are high points and locations, just like the Golan Heights, which they took over from Syria and annexed from Syria, which they still hold until today. And so the Beqa Valley has high points, mountainous region, where they can overlook the Damascus Beirut highway and able to carry out attacks on any of the Syrian troops who are there. They blockaded the highway, the Israeli army, and so they were forcing the PLO and Syrian troops who remained in Beirut, who's on the western coast, that they are unable to retreat or go back to Syria. Eventually the bombings continue. They don't enter into Beirut as they don't want to do street to street, house to house fighting, as that would be too costly. Instead, they just bomb the place for all the way for 2 months, all the way until August. Sometimes, as we mentioned, 72 bombing sorties in one day, continuously for 2 months. And the casualties, as we mentioned last week as well, that the casualties between 30 to 50,000 Palestinians and Lebanese were killed in this conflict that lasted a few months. And in terms of the number of Israelis who were killed, the number is approximately 500 between military personnel and some of those who were killed by rocket fire inside the borders of the Israeli state. And so this lasted until August. Now just a quick look at the map before and after the war. So this map is before the war. So before the invasion of Israel and its army into Lebanon. So as a result of the civil war, we have approximately we have three different groups inside Lebanon. We have the pink. The pink is controlled by the Christian militias. So they rule Beirut and basically central Lebanon and Beirut. The dark green that we can see, this dark green is the presence of the Syrian forces. So the Syrian army is in these areas and it's controlling these areas. And then we have the light green, which is on the border with the Israeli state and the occupied Palestinian territories, and this is controlled by the Palestinian forces. Yeah. So we have these three different forces. Now you can see a pocket of pink at the bottom. So again, we had some of these Christian militias who had groups in those areas. And these were the militias who were then funded and supported by the Israeli government to then create a buffer zone across the southern border of Israel, of Lebanon, and on the border with Israel. And so this is what we'll see in the next map of how the control changes. So if we now look at the next map, the control has completely changed. What we have here is the Lebanese front, which is the pink. This is basically the Lebanese forces who are allied with Israel. So the Christian forces, etc. So as you can see at the bottom, there is a pink buffer zone. This is the border of Lebanon, the southern border of Lebanon with Israel, with the Israeli state. And these are the forces that were funded and supported under the command of General Sa'ad Haddad by the Israeli government to create a buffer zone so that the PLO is unable to attack or enter into the occupied territories of Palestine without going through the areas of these Christian militias. And they were continuously trying to expand the area of control. Then we have the blue. This is the UN peacekeeping force zone. So this is where the UN peacekeepers were, to stop or to maintain the peace between the PLO and the Israeli military. The yellow area after the war, invasion of Israel, 1982, is Israeli controlled territory. So you can see they've taken over basically half of the country. The UN force keepers are UK, US, German, and other countries who are all part of this UN peacekeeping force. And they're just confined to their areas, and they basically didn't really play any role because they were there, but the war was just taking place on either side of where they were located. The Syrian army control is there on the, as you can see, has reduced from what it was before to where it is now, and they control mainly the Baqa Valley. So this was at the end of the war in August 1982. Now obviously the PLO was, as we said, the Israeli army had cut off the Beirut-Damascus highway. The PLO were now located mainly in Beirut. They had been pushed back. And so they're in Beirut on the coast. They don't really have anywhere to go. And we said that a few times from June, Yasser Arafat had proposed to the Israeli army through the US and through the other countries that the PLO is willing to withdraw from Lebanon. They are willing to withdraw from Lebanon and go to other places. However, this was not, or this announcement was not heeded to. Yasser Arafat at this time, he was not in Lebanon. He was not in Lebanon. He was in Saudi. He was in Saudi at this point in time. So he sent through his Saudi contacts to the US that we are willing to withdraw. However, no heed was paid until August. Until August, when eventually the whole of the PLO was basically surrounded, the armed members were surrounded in Beirut. And the rest of the country had fallen to the Israeli military. The Syrian forces had basically signed a peace agreement, and so there was no really fighting going on between the Syrian forces and the Israeli military at this point. So the next stage, on the 21st of August 1982, under an agreement for ceasefire, 15,000, approximately 15,000, some reports say 14,000, some say 16,000, so approximately this 15,000 PLO fighters, or the remaining fighters of the PLO, they leave Beirut by sea. They leave Beirut by sea. They're closed off. They can't go anywhere else because the Israeli military is has closed off all of those areas, like the Beirut-Damascus highway. They leave by sea. They leave behind the women and the children in Beirut, in Lebanon. They leave behind the women and children wherever they are, in the camps, in whatever areas they are in. The men, the fighters, they all leave by sea, and they go to different countries. Some of them go to Europe, some of them go to Jordan, some go to Syria, some go to Iraq. The headquarters of the PLO moves to Tunisia. The headquarters of the PLO moves to Tunisia. Yasser Arafat moves to Tunisia. So in 1982, the headquarters of the the PLO, and the main organization that was seen to be representing the Palestinians, or had been designated by the Arab League to represent the Palestinians, now moves to Tunisia. And so on the 23rd of August, so not long later, Bashir Gamayel. Now he is a Christian who is an ally of Israel. He's an ally, he's an Israeli ally, and he's the individual who they want to be the president of Lebanon. So within 2 days, he's appointed the president of Lebanon. And so now the Lebanese government is an ally of the Israeli government. However, there was a bit of an issue. When he came into power, he then made a statement, and he said personally to Israel, he said, personally, I shall always be with you. But however, politically, I shall opt for my father's neutral line between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so this caused a stir, because he was supposed to be the Israeli ally. And so he was flown on the 1st of September, so 8 days later, he was flown by a special Israeli plane from Beirut all the way to Israel, berated by the Israeli government. Why are you saying what you are saying? However, he didn't completely conform to what they were demanding of him, and he said, no, I need to stay neutral. He went back. On the 14th of September, he was assassinated. On the 14th of September, he was assassinated. He didn't last a month. And thereafter, a new president came in so he was assassinated, the fingers were pointed at, and the group that was named to be guilty was the leftist Southern Lebanese Christian groups, who are obviously the groups who are allied with Israel, as we've seen in the war. Anyway, so then a president who was allied with Israel then came into power. The war in Lebanon, however, continues. So even though at this point, basically the war in Lebanon, at this stage we say it stopped, however it doesn't stop in 1982. Battles in Lebanon continue until 2000. And Israel, as we can see, has occupied southern Lebanon. It has occupied southern Lebanon. So it's, at this point in time in 1982, it's occupying Gaza, West Bank, anything that's Palestine, it's completely occupied by Israel. The Sinai Desert, until 1982, it was occupied by Israel. In 1982 was when the last forces left the Sinai Desert. It's also necessary for Israel always to have some kind of conflict. So in 1982, when they withdraw in March from the Sinai Desert, a couple of months later in July, they have now invaded Lebanon. The Golan Heights are occupied from Syria, and now they are also occupying southern Lebanon. So you can see that their land mass and the areas that they control has increased. And obviously the internal strife continues. It continues all the way until the year 2000. Now we're not going to go into the history of Lebanon. However, it's important to note that obviously all of these have an impact. There's continuous back and forth that's taking place inside Lebanon during this whole period. We have the establishment of the Shia group in Lebanon, which everyone knows now, Hezbollah, called Hezbollah, and they were established approximately 1982 as a response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Obviously, there are a large number of Shia in Lebanon. Important to note, the Iranian Revolution was in 1979. So there were a number of Iranian volunteers who were also fighting in this war against Israeli forces. The Iranian government was obviously backing the groups who are allied with them in Lebanon to fight against Israel from that point in 1982. And then this continued, the war continues. There were attacks against US targets. So for example, the US embassy was bombed, in which a number of CIA personnel, whether they were American, even Lebanese employees of the CIA in the US embassy, approximately 64 were killed in the US embassy bombing. The first bombing, there was not one, there were two. The first one, a van with explosives went inside. It was bought in the US. This van was bought in the US. If I remember, it was New Jersey. I'm not 100% sure. If I recall, it was bought in New Jersey. It was then brought over to Lebanon. It was then registered in Lebanon. But again, it had a US plate packed with explosives. Thereafter, it was driven into the US embassy, and the US embassy was blown up. They had approximately 64 casualties. There were CIA personnel, a couple of military personnel, US servicemen, as well as Lebanese employees of the CIA in Lebanon who were killed. The US then made another more secure embassy in another part of Beirut. However, even this more secure embassy was again bombed in a similar manner with another car bombing, or what is called as a suicide bombing, and again there were a number of casualties and deaths as a result of that. That then led to the withdrawal of US forces from Lebanon and the UN peacekeeping force generally. There were attacks against other countries' targets in Lebanon as well. There were targets against Israeli targets, especially in one area where they suffered the largest, or one of the largest losses of lives and deaths in one attack, where 75 were killed in an attack on an Israeli military point in southern Lebanon. A number of prisoners who were housed in that building were also killed. So Lebanese and Palestinians who were being held by the Israeli military. The Israeli military claimed at that point that this that this explosion, which completely destroyed the whole military outpost, the building was completely collapsed onto the ground. They said that it was due to a gas leak and a gas explosion. However, the evidence points to an attack, as there were 3 eyewitnesses who saw a Peugeot car driving into the building and then exploding, causing the whole building to collapse. And it also points, there's also more collaborative evidence, as later on there was another Israeli military checkpoint, or headquarters within that same area, which was targeted the next year in a similar way, which was admitted to be a bombing by a vehicle in which, again, a large number of Israeli forces soldiers were killed, as well as the prisoners who they were holding inside that building. And so the attacks continued. However, they were not as a full-scale war, as was up till this point in August in 1982. As part of this campaign, we have the famous Sabra and Shatila massacres. So Sabra and Shatila are Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon. Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon. So from the 15th to the 18th of September 1982. So this is after August. The Lebanese Christian Phalange militia. So the Phalange militia, this is the Christian sect of Sa'd Haddad, the general who we keep coming back to, who's sponsored by Israel. So this militia is sent by Ariel Sharon and Raphael Itan, who's his deputy and one of the commanders of the army, of the Israeli army. And the instruction is eradicate all of the Palestinians in these two camps. The order and the command is eradicate them, wipe them off the surface of this earth. And these Christian militia, they go in to these camps. The Israeli army, they close off and they seal off the entire area. So none of the Palestinians from these two camps can escape, and nobody from outside can come and help and assist them. And so they were completely surrounded. The Israeli forces have sealed off the whole area, and then these militia went on a rampage. They killed every single person, massacred everyone in these camps. The death toll, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, was at 2,750. However, the actual number of people who were killed was unknown. Other reports and other historians say that the numbers are probably much higher than 2,750, as the number of Palestinian refugees in those camps was much higher than just a couple of thousand or a few thousand. So this is the famous massacres that took place, and I'm sure you all have heard of the Sabra and Shatila massacres. So this took place as part of this war in Lebanon. As a response to this massacre, we have UN Resolution 521, which was passed on the 19th of September 1982. And the UN said that this is an act of genocide. So this is relevant to what's taking place, for example, right now in the court, the international court, where South Africa has taken the Israeli government, accusing them of genocide. They were already sentenced by the UN in 1982 of carrying out an act of genocide in Sabra and Shatila camps. It said that the Sabra and Shatila massacres, in fact, nobody voted against this resolution. Nobody voted against it. The UK, US, and co, they abstained, but they did not vote against this resolution. And this resolution said that these massacres were an act of genocide, and it's a crime under international law, which the whole civilized world condemns. And whether they are private officials, public officials, statesmen, whether the crime is committed on religious, racial, political, or any other grounds, are punishable. However, obviously, this was this UN resolution, but nothing really came of it. Obviously, there was a reaction, international condemnation, etc., which was why the UN resolution was overwhelmingly passed with no opposition. Inside Israel itself, there were demonstrations against Ariel Sharon for what took place in Sabra and Shatila, as he was the main man responsible. He's the one who gave the command as the defense minister, and he gave direct command for this to happen. And so some reports say 100,000. At the time, they said 400,000 Israeli citizens are demonstrating against Ariel Sharon. This was revised much later to be 100,000 or maybe less. It's possible that these numbers were there in order to show that the population are not in support of these actions. You see much later on in 2001 that all of these hundreds of thousands who condemned Ariel Sharon all came out and voted for Ariel Sharon to become the Prime Minister of Israel. but that's a little while later, which we'll find out. So while there were demonstrations by thousands of Israelis at the time against Ariel Sharon to be removed from his position as a defense minister, etc. However, later on he ends up being the Prime Minister of Israel in 2001. So in the last few sessions, we've covered a lot of the conflicts related to the surrounding countries. So we've covered Egypt a lot. We covered Jordan, the Black September and the groups in Jordan, Syria, the Golan Heights, and the Lebanese war. But what's actually happening inside the occupied territories? Because now we have, obviously we have 1982, but coming on to 1987, it's since 1967 to 1987, 20 years. 20 years, and every single Palestinian is occupied. Every single Palestinian is occupied. There is no area which is free from Israeli rule. So since 1967, every single Palestinian is stateless. Every single Palestinian. There is no state that they can go to. They are refugees either in the Arab countries like Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, or all the other countries like Iraq and Saudi and other places around the world. And within the borders of what should be Palestine, ruled in all of the areas by the Israeli government. They are all refugees and controlled by the Israeli government. There is no area which is free and which is not occupied by direct Israeli control. In terms of their work conditions, whatever job an Israeli citizen gets, if the Palestinian gets the same job, he gets half the salary. His wages are half the wages of an Israeli. The tax rate, they have to pay taxes to the occupier, who will then use that tax to increase his military and his security apparatus to harm the Palestinians. But they have to pay a higher rate of tax than the Israelis. At the same time, unequal social services. They don't receive, even though they pay higher taxes, they receive less medical care, they receive less services in terms of the services that are supposed to be provided in their areas by a normal government. The arable land where they can plant and grow and farm, 30% of it is taken and annexed by the Israeli government and given to Jewish settlers. There are continuous, daily harassment, arrest, beatings, abuse of Palestinians on a daily basis. Not a day goes by without Palestinians being harassed or abused somewhere. Checkpoints in all of the areas. Now remember, they are living under not civilian rule. The Palestinians who are under the rule of the Israeli government are living under military rule. Now some of them have been living under military rule since 1948. Since 1948, once at the end of the war. And so they're living under military rule. There's checkpoints everywhere. It's very similar basically what's happening right now in the West Bank, as we see in the West Bank. Checkpoints in all places, stop and search. We have stop and search powers here, there are stop and search powers there. A Palestinian leaves his home to walk down the street to go and buy something. Suddenly they'll say, stop, show me your documents. Stand to the side, search his whole body to see what he is carrying. And so body searches, document searches, show us your ID just for walking down the road. To go to work, they have to go through checkpoints. To travel to a different location to visit family, they have to go through checkpoints. Not just that, they have to ask for permits to visit family members. Within a period of 20 years, 1967 to 1987, 535,000 Palestinians are arrested. 535,000. More than 500,000 Palestinians are arrested just in a 20-year period. The refugee camps, majority of them are living in refugee camps. They've all been pushed out of their homes. The refugee camps, they have very few services. So for example, they don't have running water. They don't have a sewage system. Those refugee camps, if you look at the images are available. They have the camps where the Palestinian refugees are residing, and you have the sewage running in the streets. in the streets, in between the homes of the Palestinians and where they are living in these camps. And as I said, they need permits to travel, they need permits for business. To establish a business, they need to have a permit. To construct their own buildings, their homes, their own land, they need a permit from the occupying Israeli government. And most of the time, those permits are not granted and they're not given. Farmers, they're restricted on what they can produce. So they aren't allowed to produce anything that will cause them to be in competition with the Israeli farmers. So anything that the Israelis are producing, they restrict the Palestinians from producing those goods. So there's a restriction on their farming. And the number of settlers in the areas of the West Bank and Gaza increase. In those, by 1988, there are 64,000 settlers. The numbers now are much higher, but there are 64,000 settlers just by 1988. So the number of settlers have now increased. And so this is the general situation of the Palestinians inside Palestine. Daily basis, they are going through inhumane treatment. Daily basis, they are going through abuse, torture, imprisonment, themselves, their families, etc. This situation is happening inside. Obviously, we've discussed the attacks that were taking place from, for example, Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, and initially in the first years from Egypt. However, inside the occupied territories, there was a bit of movement against the Israeli government as well. So Palestinians, if they were able to gain some kind of weapons, then they would do an attack on Israeli targets, maybe a checkpoint, maybe an Israeli military vehicle, a jeep, etc. However, there were not many attacks as such, maybe a few hundred over a year or so, just a couple of hundred here and there. Many of these wouldn't end in, for example, deaths or injuries. The perpetrators, the Palestinians, would be arrested, they would be imprisoned. But this continued. So there was an internal movement within these occupied territories to try and resist the occupation, physically resist the occupation. However, they did not have much strength inside these territories. Now, the PLO was appointed as the representative of the Palestinian people by the Arab League. And so they are seen internationally as a representative of the Palestinian people. However, they are listed, so all of the members of the PLO, Fatah were the main, and then the other groups which we mentioned previously, we went through the main groups. If you remember, the PFLP and the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and splinter groups. But the main group, Fatah, every single group and all of these organizations are listed as terrorist entities by not only Israel, by the Israeli government, but also by the US, by the UK and Europe and European governments. So they're all listed as terrorist entities and terrorist organizations. So basically every single Palestinian who is resisting and is trying to resist against the occupation, every single one is a terrorist. Every single one is a terrorist. All of these organizations are terrorist organizations. The organization itself is not recognized by Israel as representing the Palestinians. Therefore, Israel refuses to have any kind of communicate with Yasser Arafat or with the PLO. Obviously, the PLO at this point does not recognize the state of Israel, and so they refuse to engage with the state of Israel as well. But now, Yasser Arafat, who's the head of Fatah, and Fatah being the largest group and having majority of the seats in the PLO, he is also the head of the PLO. So he's the head of Fatah and he's also the head of the PLO. The PLO was initially meant to have an army or a military wing that was designated by the Arab League. However, this mainly was made by the Syrian government, and they weren't really effective in any way, shape or form. There were a few members who mainly stayed within Syria, and that's about it. The main military force of the PLO were the forces of Fatah, were the military forces of Fatah, and thereafter the other groups who we mentioned, who each had between 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 fighters each. Fatah obviously being the group which had the most. So altogether the numbers come up to, of all of these groups, about 20,000, approximately 20,000. But all of these numbers are outside Palestine. All of these numbers are outside Palestine. And we mentioned previously that up to this point, all of the groups are secular liberal groups. Secular liberal groups, nationalistic groups who are just working for a secular liberal freedom for Palestine. And this is mentioned in their constitution, in the makeup of these organizations. And we discussed this at that point in time. So inside Palestine itself, although PLO is seen as working for the Palestinians, the Palestinians don't really have much, the ones who are residing under Israeli occupation, they don't really have much of a link with the PLO. In that sense, they don't vote for the PLO, they don't have elections, etc. for all of the individuals. Obviously they can't, they're all occupied. However, PLO does have its representatives in the West Bank, it has its representatives in Gaza. And how generally the systems work is, the Israeli government gives the permits for the Palestinians to make the institutions, have educational institutions, for example, to build a hospital or to build certain social services. And they will monitor, however, they won't be involved in the administration of these institutions. So, for example, the Gaza Islamic University is established in Gaza. It's the first Islamic university in the land of Palestine. The university has an Islamic ethos. For example, the male classes, female classes are separated, but there's education for both. The board members and the teachers have an Islamic mindset, etc. The dean of the university is appointed by the PLO. The dean of the university is appointed by the PLO, as the PLO has been appointed again by the Arab state as a representative of the Palestinians. So they're supposed to look after all the administration of the Palestinian centers, etc. So the PLO appoints the dean of the university. Israel doesn't get involved. The locals are not happy with the dean of the university that has been appointed. The dean of the university was a secondary school teacher of mathematics. His name was Riyadh. But he was not of an Islamic mindset. He decided, he had plans to have mixed classes within the university, have the students, not the girl students, for example, not allowed to wear hijab inside, etc. And so there was a clash between the locals who wanted the university to remain with an Islamic ethos and the head that was set by the PLO. And so they weren't, all of the Palestinians were not had not agreed on every single point, especially with regards to Islamic ethos. We'll go into this a bit detail very soon, inshallah. However, the background to this is what took place in Egypt. So in Egypt, we mentioned that Jamal Abdel Nasser, so these are a few points which are important, which I think we need to mention on the side. They have a role to play in the events. So Jamal Abdel Nasser, when he came to power, if you remember, we said that he made an allies. He made with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and he promised them. He made certain promises to them, so that they will come to power and they will have certain posts in the government. However, he renegated on his promises to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood then voiced the opposition to Jamal Abdel Nasser, and Jamal Abdel Nasser was the one who quashed brutally the Muslim Brotherhood outlawed it in Egypt. And many of the Muslim Brotherhood members, male and female, were killed, imprisoned, tortured, brutally treated, and the history of what took place in Egypt is there. However, not only was there an attack on them physically in this way, but at the same time there was a media propaganda against Islamism, against Islam. And so it was portrayed by the Egyptian government that anyone who talks about Islam, who wants Islam, etc., this person is not a good individual. This is a person who causes fitna and trouble in society. This is a person who wants our society to be backwards, etc. So those who are calling for Islam, obviously within Egypt itself, they had the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. But initially, Egypt was also in administrative control of the Gaza Strip of Gaza. And so the Egyptian radio was also heard by all of the residents in Gaza. And so they also continued to hear this propaganda against those who have an Islamic mindset in Gaza. And this built on their concept and the conceptions that they had of those people who called towards Islam, etc. To the extent that when Jamal Abdel Nasser died, when Anwar Sadat became the president, a number of the khutaba and those who were doing the Jumu'ah after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser, as they had an Islamic movement in Gaza, which we will discuss shortly in the next sessions, when they came onto the minbar and spoke with regards to the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and a number of them said that Jamal Abdel Nasser was an individual who was quashing Islam and he had suppressed Islam, etc. Some of the imams of these masajid were beaten by the locals when they came out of the masjid after Salah. They were beaten by the locals for what they said. Some of them were rebuked, some of them were beaten. This was the extent to which the population, even in Gaza, was looking and viewed the Islamic movements at the time, whether they were in Gaza or whether they were in any other areas. In the initial war in 1948, when the Egyptian forces entered into Palestine to push back and to quash the announcement of the Israeli state, a lot of the forces who had joined the Egyptian army and were in Gaza, stationed specifically in Gaza, were members who were not full-time members of the army but were actually volunteers, and they were all from the Muslim Brotherhood. They were all from the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were the ones who were the battalions inside Gaza. And we went through of how Gaza remained as the only place that was not overrun by the Israeli military at that time, whereas the other Egyptian forces were overrun. And so they remained in Gaza for a while. The Muslim Brotherhood were there, and they made connections with the locals in terms of the Islamic mindset. However, once Jamal Abdel Nasser came into power, he did a purge. The Muslim Brotherhood members who were volunteering, many of them returned back to Egypt, and then eventually, obviously, during the Suez Canal crisis, etc., Israel annexed the whole area and became in control of Gaza and the Sinai Desert. But this left a lasting impact on the local population in Gaza as well as other areas. The revival in Gaza continued, an Islamic revival in Gaza continued, and this then led to the events that followed the situation in 1988 and after 1987, coming up to the first Intifada, which we will discuss next week, inshallah. So these 20 years of complete occupation by the Israeli government of all the areas of Palestine, including parts of the Sinai Desert until 1980, or this whole Sinai Desert until 1982, the Golan Heights until today, and then southern Lebanon until 2000. This scenario is now unfolding. The Palestinians initially thought that the Arab armies of these Arab states would save them, but they were defeated in 1948 and in the wars that followed thereafter, 1967, 1973, and so they were left with no hope from the Arab armies. They then had a look towards maybe UN resolutions, etc. Later on, again, they brought no fruit to their state. The US maybe intervening. There was no intervention from the US except on the side of Israel. They looked towards Yasser Arafat and the PLO to push their case forward. But again, the PLO was removed from Lebanon in 1982, and their headquarters moved to Tunisia. And so the Palestinians are now in the 1980s with basically no real leadership, no way to resist the occupation, and a continuing military rule over every single Palestinian within the boundaries of the original state of Palestine, and the Palestinians who are now in their millions refugees in all of the surrounding states. Inshallah, next week we will discuss the first Intifada, which was known as the Intifada al-Ula or the Intifada al-Hijara, the uprising of the stone uprising. In detail, the events that led up to it, the groups that came and were formed at that time. We'll discuss a number of important individuals as well who played a significant role at that point in time and continued to play a role later on, inshallah ta'ala. Before we finish, if there are any questions with regards to what we discussed today. At the end, we discussed a few miscellaneous topics, but if you have any questions, inshallah. Any questions? No? Second week in a row, no questions? I prefer if you ask questions. Because once a Sheikh, he came to to give a speech in one of the masajid, and he said to the people, do you know what I'm going to talk about? Everyone said no. So he said, why should I talk to people who don't know what they've come for? And he left. He came the next day and he said, do you know what I'm going to talk about? Everyone said, yeah. So he said, if you already know, why do I need to deliver the speech? He left. So he came the third day. They called him again. He said, do you know what I'm talking about? Half the people said yes, half the people said no. He said, the people who know, tell the people who don't know. And he left. Anyway, so that's just an anecdote. But if there's questions, at least I know there's some kind of interaction. But if I've covered everything, then alhamdulillah. Khair, inshallah. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to have the correct understanding of the events that took place and lead up to what we are seeing today. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to understand the correct course of action that we should take to assist our brothers and sisters and Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and this blessed land of Al-Quds and that which surrounds it, and the Sham. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla alleviates the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. It's now 105 days since the offensive and the escalation and the violence and oppression against our brothers and sisters. They, by the grace of Allah and by the help of Allah, they continue to show patience, they continue to show courage, they continue to bear the oppression without complaining, and by only saying that Allah is enough for us and being patient. They have not let up in 105 days. Let us not let up in our support, in our contribution, in our actions, in every single deed that we can do, in our ibadah, in our dua, in our salah, and the rectification of our lives and our communities, to assist our brothers and sisters. It's very important. If they can take the bombing, they can take the killing, they can take the pillaging, they can bear all of this for the sake of Allah, then we can at least continue to support them and make dua for them. which does not even disturb our rest, and it does not even disturb and causes even a minor bit of discomfort in our lives. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal, that He gives us the opportunity to assist the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, because if we don't, then Allah Azza wa Jal will replace us with those who will. So we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal make us from the servants of His deen, the servants of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And as we make dua for our brothers and sisters in Gaza, we also make dua for our brothers and sisters in all of the occupied territories, and we make dua for our brothers and sisters in the West Bank, where in the last couple of days the atrocities and the attacks of the Israeli military has greatly increased. Drone strikes are now taking place continuously in the West Bank. The number of martyrs and shuhada are increasing, and a number of army units who are fighting in Gaza have now been designated to areas in the West Bank, like Jenin, like Al-Quds, like Al-Khalil, like Tul Karam, like the camps of Nur Shams, and other camps. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal grant our brothers and sisters there also steadfastness. May Allah Azza wa Jal also free them from the clutches of this oppression and tyranny. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal grants victory to peace, to justice, and to the word of Allah. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal brings back the peace and prosperity to the Muslims and the believers and the Ummah as they experienced during the times of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. آمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا سبحانك الله وبحمدك سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك